Welcome to a new little series. This one's all about treasures from the arcades. Games that aren't necessarily amongst the best known titles nowadays, games that were innovative, perhaps more influential than people realised, possibly a little bit weird, and games that aren't necessarily from the really big studios that I at some point intend to cover in full. Ideally I'll cover 10 or maybe more games from each year, starting today with 1980. Just to stress the point, this isn't a place to cover the likes of, say, Pac-Man, Missile Command and Defender. Instead, these may be games you don't actually know, even if some of them were actually pretty successful at the time. I think that's about enough explanation, so let's start with a title that really nails the bill head on. It's one of the most successful games of 1980, a game absolutely like no other at the time, one that was massively influential, and yet it's not necessarily a game that's all that well known in the West. Crazy Climber made its way to the Japanese arcades in October of 1980 courtesy of Nichibutsu, or Nihon Busan as they were also known. When this game came out in the West, it certainly made a few ripples, but didn't really do a massive lot. Perhaps it was just a bit too out there and a bit too different from usual arcade fare for it to hugely capture people's imagination. Not a failure or anything like that, but not very notable. In Japan, however, this game was, put simply, an absolute behemoth. It was the third most successful arcade game of the whole year, beaten only by Pac-Man and Galaxian. More than just popularity though, it's a ludicrously influential title. While Crazy Climber isn't exactly a platformer in the traditional sense, it had a whopping great impact on the genre in ways that we will soon get into. If you have never played Crazy Climber, then the idea is simple enough. There's a bunch of big old skyscrapers, and you've got to climb up to the top, avoiding various obstacles as you go. Everything from windows that get shut on your hands, to flower pots, to malfunctioning signs and frickin' King Kong. The controls are where things get wild, and they can still be tricky to master. You've got two joysticks, and they essentially represent the left and right arms of our daredevil hero. The idea is to get into a bit of a rhythm. Push those joysticks up to reach out to the next ledge, pull them down to pull yourself up, make sure you're able to shimmy to the left and right to avoid obstacles, and try not to grab onto windows that are shut. You can't use them until they open again, and you don't really want to be hanging around and not moving if you can help it. It is a little tricky to get used to doing this, but you will start getting to grips with it after a few unsuccessful attempts. As odd as it all sounds, even 45 years after the fact, there is one very important mechanic that Crazy Climber introduced to the arcade world. It is a game where you go up. How high can you get? Games, particularly platformers where making your way up a stage is the key goal, are soon going to become the biggest thing going in the arcade. And it actually all started right here, with Crazy Climber. There are two games that the seminal Donkey Kong, one of the most popular and influential games in arcade history, wouldn't really exist without. I'm going to look at both in this video, and Crazy Climber is kind of the first of them. Hell, Kong was a villain in Crazy Climber even before Nintendo's game. The story of how Crazy Climber actually came out is pretty cool, really. It's the work of a man named Shigeki Fujiwara, and I believe that he was actually working at a company called Jurudan. This is one of those companies that were mainly involved in electronics or software, but were used by companies like Nichibutsu for game creation. Ikigami Sushinki is probably the most famous example of such a company, the guys that worked on Donkey Kong. Anyway, for Fujiwara's inspiration, I am mainly consulting the archives of YouTube legend, that being the incredibly talented, thoroughly awesome and sadly recently departed Pac-Man QC, a man who had such great passion for the arcade classics and did make a video all about Crazy Climber a few years ago. Fujiwara was inspired by two things. Firstly, an appreciation for old silent comedies, in particular Harold Lloyd's seminal Safety Last from 1923. You know, the one where Lloyd climbs the skyscraper, he's hanging off a clock and all of that. There was that, as well as recent news stories, in particular one where a man dressed as Spider-Man had climbed up the side of a skyscraper. In other words, what we now call free climbing, Alan Webber and folks like that. Now I wondered about this part of the story a little, and I'm curious if it's an amalgamation of a bunch of things. After all, there's Dan Goodwin, the man who did indeed dress up as Spider-Man and free climbed up the Sears Tower. However, that happened in 1981. Of course, you've got the old Amazing Spider-Man live-action show, which featured lots of Spidey climbing up buildings, probably wild stunt work performed by the great Fred Waugh. But at the time of Crazy Climber, the most famous skyscraper climb in recent years was, I imagine, George Willig, who was nicknamed Spider-Man and in 1977 climbed up the South Tower of the World Trade Center. Mind you, maybe it was something closer to home. I have seen people say that Crazy Climber was inspired by somebody actually climbing up Nihon Busan's office building, and the company deciding to make a game based on that, but that seems too cute. Either way, take all of these things together and you've got the inspiration that leads to Crazy Climber, and from there, a whole load of games blossom. Everything from the most successful games of all time to the odd little shitposty games today that usually involve some ludicrously hard and obtusely controlled mission, usually getting up to the top of something, has Crazy Climber in its DNA. It is a massive level of importance, and as such the game should probably get a whole lot more roses. Just don't put them in a pot and drop them on its head. Of course, we can't not mention the other game that was a pretty huge influence on old Con. I imagine more people in the West are probably aware nowadays of Universal's Space Panic than they are of Crazy Climber, if only because if you go ahead and search first platformer ever, this game is likely going to be the one that comes up. And indeed, that's correct. Our hero can't jump, but he does have platforms to run about on, he's got ladders to climb up and down, and most importantly, he's got a shovel which he uses to dig a hole, trap those aliens, and then whack them down to their death. In fact, if he's desperate, he can even use the hole he's dug to take a quick trip down a level, if those creatures are closing in. Speaking of which, the aliens do get stronger, and they may well need to fall down more than one level in order for them to meet their maker. It is quite the maniacal game, seeing as the aliens are speedy, they definitely seem to have a mind of their own, and you've got a very tight time limit. All of the aliens in a stage need to be squared away before you run out of air and suffer a rather nasty death indeed. I mean, gee, even in a game from 1980, asphyxiation doesn't look pretty. Maybe it's the lack of sound that does it, I don't know. I digress. Space Panic wasn't initially much of a success at all in the States, but again it was very big indeed in Japan. Not as big a hit as Crazy Climber, but still very high up the charts, and that success continued into 1981. I dare say it enjoyed a bit of popularity in Europe and the UK too, seeing as there were a good few clones of the game made for platforms like the old ZX Spectrum, Dragon 32 and the like. Now, of course, the game itself has something even earlier for inspiration. The 1979 top-down digging game Henko Alien, initially made by the University of Tokyo's Theoretical Science Group before being turned into an arcade game by Denki Onkyo, features most of the mechanics that we see in Space Panic, with Panic's main addition being the platforms that our hero can fall through. Still, this is where platforming begins in many ways. Not just with the platforms, obviously, but with gravity also playing a big part in proceedings. More directly, computer clones of Space Panic inspired the creation of the incredibly successful Lode Runner, which spread from the Apple II to so many other machines, as well as the arcade. And then, of course, there is the case of Kong. Now, of course, Donkey Kong itself influenced so freaking much, and is a much more famous game for damn good reasons. It took building blocks from Space Panic, made something different and clearly better, and it became the biggest thing on the arcade floor. Still, this game, while still being pretty decent to play nowadays, does have an important place, and I do think that if you take this game and Crazy Climber and put them together, you do get something that's pretty damn close to the legend that is Kong. We're going back to Nichibutsu for the third game, and indeed we're going back to the work of Shigeki Fujiwara, for he made two classic games in 1980. With Galaxian being one of the biggest things going in the arcade, there were obviously tons of games hugely influenced by Namco's title, and few of them are better than the almighty Moon Cresta, which was initially known as Eagle on its North American release. This was Fujiwara's first game, coming out a couple of months before Crazy Climber. It takes the Galaxian formula, makes the ships bigger, adds a whole lot more variety in the waves and how they attack, plus a couple of mechanics of its own. Firstly, you've got a slightly different ship for each life you have. The first one only has a single blaster, but it's very quick. The second is a little bigger and slower, but has 2 blasters. And the third is similar to the second, only bigger and slower still. And then of course there's the docking sequence that you get every few waves, something which makes survival damn important. If you successfully use those thrusts to dock with another part of the ship, then you can use both of them together, and while this may be a bigger target, it allows you to lay down a lot more firepower. Hell, if you're really good, you can be firing the equivalent of about 5 shots at once, if you connect all 3 ships up. Indeed, this feature itself may have been a bit of an inspiration on Namco, with 1981's Galaga allowing you to put 2 fighters together for double the firepower. The changes really do a lot to differentiate the game from Galaxian and its myriad of clones, and it just plays so damn well. It's typically challenging, with enemies that are fast, hard to hit, and pretty damn tricky in how they move, especially when they gain abilities such as cloaking in later stages, or they just come at you directly. But then that's part and parcel of the Golden Age experience. And of course this kicked off a whole series of sequels and spin-offs, a lot of which are damn good in their own right. There's Terra Cresta, Terra Force, Armed Formation F, all the way up to 2022's Soul Cresta. Fabulous arcade indeed. Let's leave Japan for now and go over to the States. Specifically, we're off to El Cajon in California, the home of Cinematronics. Now, if you say the name Cinematronics to people in no games anyway, chances are pretty good that Dragon's Lair is the first game they'll think of, being such a huge hit and all of that. However, Cinematronics released plenty of games in the years before Dirk Ladarian's adventure, and a good few of them were hits. In particular, the excellent and often quite innovative Vector titles released by a man who I have mentioned a few times before, and who I consider one of the great unsung heroes of the Golden Age. The late, great Tim Skelly, who I've previously looked at when covering Gottlieb and specifically his classic 1982 title, Reactor. Cinematronics is where Skelly initially made his name, and I've got 3 excellent games by him to look at in this video, starting with Armour Attack. You've got a speedy little jeep and an endless procession of tanks and choppers to destroy. They're always coming from the edges of the screen, and the joy of this game is to scoot like hell around these buildings, represented with a nice little graphic overlay, trying to get the drop on them. The chopper, of course, doesn't have to worry about going around buildings, and you've always got to watch for that, but it does fall in one shot. The tanks, meanwhile, are obviously slow, but they're always tracking you, and you may also need to spend a bit more time taking them out. They need one shot to be immobilised, and then another to be fully destroyed. It is certainly a bummer if you hit one of these tanks with a single shot, only to then be taken out whilst it's taking its last stand. There's even a little Easter egg, something you often find with Skelly's games. The beeping that you hear at the beginning of each life is actually Morse code, and it translates into "don't register", this being a little protest from Tim Skelly at the reintroduction of registering for the draft. Quite a frantic game, and just the sort of title that always makes me feel like having another go. Plus, you can play it with a friend. Rip-Off is actually the Vector game that, according to an interview for the old Halcyon Days book, Skelly was most proud of, and it was also the most successful of his Cinematronics Vector titles. It is easy to see why through playing it. This is a highly refreshing take on classic Vector shooter action for 1980. You play as a ship that, for once, has infinite lives. Hooray! Your enemies have one simple goal: to steal the canisters, or meatballs as Skelly calls them, at the centre of the screen. Essentially, they want to blast you and take that window of opportunity to grab those little triangles and escape to the edge of the screen, although you can still stop them even after they've grabbed the canister, meatball, triangle, dairily. This feature's quite cool because it does mean that the little segments can end up scattered all over the play area, as opposed to always being in the middle, which of course can make them even harder to defend at points. Having infinite lives changes how you play as well. While normally you will be shooting enemies just as you would in any usual title of this vein, if there is one tank left and they're trying to run off with a canister, well, you may find it easier to just crash the hell into them as opposed to gunning them down. One strange thing that happens with this game, at least when you're playing it in MAME, is that all the vectors weirdly double up after the second go, making everything a lot thicker. I'm guessing that this is a little bug that's in MAME and not something you would find in the original arcade cabinet, but it does look rather cool. I highly recommend this one. It's a game that really feels like it plays out differently every time you have a go, it's done to an absolute turn, and the spin on the usual defensive antics really make it stand out. And again, 2 players can play Rip-Off at once. It is, along with Armour Attack, one of the earliest cooperative 2-player arcades, and that really helped the game become a big hit. Fabulous. Lastly, here's Star Castle. While Skelly was the sole person behind both Armour Attack and Rip-Off, Star Castle actually initially comes from a demo made by Dan Sunday and Larry Rosenthal at Vectorbeam, a company that Cinematronics bought in 1979, and it was also coded by Scott Bowden. This is a hell of a tough game. The Star Castle in the centre is protected by rins that spew out mines. The rin will respawn totally if it's fully destroyed, so you always want to leave a bit of it, and the castle is always following you. The idea is to create a gap in those rins that will give you a good shot at the Star Castle, ideally before it can take a shot at you. Not easy at all, but very satisfying when you actually get it done. Certainly for 1980, the inner workings of Star Castle feel very complex, like you're up against an actually intelligent enemy, as opposed to something that's just aimlessly bouncing around the screen, and that in particular really makes you want to go back and try to take it out again. There are, again, more curious Easter eggs and behind-the-scenes stories here. A very funny one is that apparently the starfield in the overlay was actually traced from a centerfold taken from the adult magazine Oui. Management at Cinematronics were quite furious when they found this out and even thought about pulling the frickin' game, although thankfully this didn't happen, they saw sense. It is also definitely worth noting that the Atari 2600 classic Yar's Revenge was actually inspired by an abortive attempt to port Star Castle over to the console, and you can definitely see the similarities. Another Cinematronics classic that should absolutely be played, and the cabinet art for this game is also a frickin' beaut as well. Indeed, all 3 of these games look really snazzy on the arcade floor. Tim Skelly's work should be just celebrated way more. Sadly, he passed away in 2020, and it's a shame he's no longer around to talk about it any further. How about Exidy? Surprisingly, even though I've done quite a lot of arcade vids, this may actually be the first time I have properly looked at a game of theirs. And while these guys are mainly famed for their gun games, shooting gallery affairs and all that, this one's a little different. Here's Targ, a top-down actioner where, again, you're in charge of a tank and you're up against enemy ships that all look like chunky arrows. The goal is to destroy them all and be the last man standing, at which point you'll do it again against even quicker ships that are more plentiful in number. Simple, really, but tough and quite engaging. Again, it's another game that I had to keep sticking more credits into, just to try and get further. I quite like the movement of your tank. The speed makes accurate movement something that takes a little while to master, gotta be quick with those turns, and it does have a bit of momentum as well, having to brake before making U-turns and so on. A good tactic in the game is to U-turn in order to destroy a ship that's chasing you, although the momentum means you've got to make sure there's enough distance between yourself and said ship in order to actually do it, all while making sure there's not another ship creeping up on you. This is a very cool game, although Exidy actually followed it up with an even better sequel later on in the year. This is Spectar. We've still got very blue and green graphics, although there's a lot more detail in the maze, and the layouts also change. Rather than destroying all the ships, you've got to collect dots now in order to go to the next level, and now there's a wider variety of enemies, including ones that will shoot missiles, as opposed to simply trying to run into you. The game is still very quick and all that, and on the whole, yeah, Spectar is a better game than Targ, seeing as it's got a lot more details and cool features. However, you should definitely play both of them. I suppose that covering Spectar as well as Targ takes the amount of featured games in this video up to 11 rather than 10, but hey ho. I can't imagine that's a particularly major problem for anyone. Lastly, we're going back to Japan for a couple of weird and obscure efforts. Firstly, we're looking once again at Universal, and here's something neat. Cheeky Mouse. This is a simple game, but one that does have some neat character. You must protect your cheese supplies from hordes of mice that descend the screen, chew their way through the floor, and then try and bring it back to their hideout. I suppose it's a little bit like Rip-Off in this regard. Again, you haven't necessarily lost the cheese if they grab it at the bottom. You can certainly hammer these rodents when they're on the way back up, which is very doable if there's only one opening in play. There's nothing hugely innovative on show here, and in the main this is just a rather nifty and very frantic game. One that, like a lot of Universal games from the time, also has a lot of colour and personality in the graphics going for it. When you're dealing with games from this early period, 1979, 1980 and all that, you do often get a major abundance of space shooters and the like. So something like Cheeky Mouse does provide a refreshing alternative that isn't ubiquitous. Cool stuff. Next, here's another game of defensive play, one that's a fair bit like the legendary Missile Command, although it's a bit brighter and more sci-fi as opposed to apocalyptic. Future Flash is by Hui Technology, a pretty short-lived company that only released a couple of dozen or so games during the Golden Age, and this one did also get imported to the States, where it was released by Amstar and rechristened Laserbase. Much like Missile Command, the idea is to take down the various ships and missiles and the like head in the way of the 4 ships that are flying across the planet's surface. This time the ships are defending themselves rather than your own missiles coming from launchers on the ground. It is a little simplified compared to the Atari game. You only get one button to fire, so the ship that's attacking depends on where your cursor's located, kind of like the Atari 2600 version of Missile Command. And there is also a little bonus section to take on in between planets, which is a neat addition. Looks very nice for the time as well. Also, I love the spiel at the beginning of the game, that glorious, slightly dodgy English, the affirming message at the end. You know, it deserves a full dramatic reading.
We are the elite guard soldiers. Take your weapons. We must defend our planet. Put a coin in the slot, and we will reveal a vast, unlimited universe. Push the start button, and an exciting game world will open for you.
Now, Future Flash is scarcely regarded anywhere nowadays, and it barely made a blip at the time, but I would say it's worth giving this one a go. And finally, here's something odd and very obscure. It's Dora-chan. This game was released by a virtually unknown outfit at the time named Qual Denshi, although they did become famous under a different name, that being Alpha Denshi, or ADK, folks who made lots of games for companies like SNK and Sega, as well as releasing a few titles themselves. This game is a rather simple and crude dot eater. The idea is to eat up all the dots on the bottom, eat them up again, go up the top and eat all the dots there, and then attack the smiling cat that's up the top, all while various other cute hand-drawn sprites are chasing you. Obviously, these hand-drawn sprites are the main thing that stands out about the game. They're certainly well done, and indeed one in particular may be quite familiar. Of course, the big face up the top there is Doraemon, taken from the highly popular Japanese manga of the same name. Naturally, Crowell Denshi must have been expecting the use of Doraemon to drive sales, and my initial thought about this was that this must be one of the earliest examples of an arcade game using a license. However, it actually isn't. Crowell Denshi never actually got the license to use the Doraemon character, and when the manga's publisher, Shogakukan, was made aware of this game's existence, obviously they were most displeased, and all copies of Dora-chan had to be recalled. Whoopsie daisy. With this in mind, it is a wonder that we can play this game at all, but presumably it must have gained enough traction in the short time that it was out there for some boards to survive, and ultimately for it to be preserved. It's not a particularly good game by any means, but it's certainly an intriguing curio. Even more intriguing, perhaps, is that Crowell Denshi had plans to release a modification to this game that would have replaced Doraemon with his sister, Doraemi. They may well have produced this, but it hasn't been discovered yet. Kind of amusing, if obviously coincidental, that this happened well over a year before the arrival of Miss Pac-Man. And there we are, a bunch of titles from 1980 that you may not necessarily be fully familiar with, that you may want to have a go at. Naturally, whenever I next do this again, when I want something a bit smaller as a video, we'll be going to 1981, and there'll be some cool stuff there. But until then, hopefully you've enjoyed this video here, and until next time, bye for now.